I'm not going to mess this up, am I? I'll try not to mess it up. Hi, I'm Bob Hildebrand from the Department of History. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Shell Lecture this year. First, a couple of words about Herbert Shell. Dean Shell served in the Department of History for a very long time. He'd already been here a long time when I came, and he hung around and helped out after I was here until he died in 1994. He was with the university for 43 years and worked with very many students, many of whom went on to get PhDs and to do distinguished things with their careers. He also was really the founder of the graduate college at the University of South Dakota, and after his death, this lectureship was created in his honor and in his name. I also get to introduce our speaker tonight. If you've looked at your programs, you already know that Jim Marten is a distinguished scholar. What you probably don't know, though, is that he earned his master's degree here at the University of South Dakota, where I'm proud to say that he was my teaching assistant and wrote his master's thesis with me. Now, I'd like to say that I taught him everything he knows. But in fact, I taught him everything I know, and then he went on and learned a lot more. The fact is that Jim taught me a few things. I remember meeting Jim in my office near the end of his second semester at USD. He told me that he hadn't begun to write his thesis yet, but that he intended to do so over the summer and that he would graduate in July. I nodded my head and smiled. Certain that we'd still be talking about this in the fall and probably still talking about it when it was snowing the next year, because nobody finished their thesis 1 year, and certainly not in the summer. But in fact, Jim finished his thesis in time for summer commencement. Turned out to be a superb study of the New Deal in South Dakota. I also remember the next spring when I had to revise my lectures on the New Deal to reflect what Jim had taught me in his thesis. After leaving South Dakota, Jim earned his PhD at the University of Texas and went on to teach at Marquette University, where he is professor of history and the chair of the history department. Jim is the author of The Children's Civil War, a terrific book. I recommend that you read it. It was selected as an outstanding academic book by Choice Magazine. And also of Sing Not War, The Lives of Union and Confederate Veterans and Gilded Age Americans, which I think has something to do probably with this lecture tonight. Jim is the editor of Children and War, a historical anthology, and Children and Child Welfare in the Progressive Era, a brief history with documents. The title of Jim's talk tonight is A Generation Set Apart, Union Civil War Veterans and Northern Society.
I forgot about that talk till just now. Bob is actually one of 3 or 4 mentors I've had between, well, I need to, in fairness to about 70 or 80 other family members who graduated like me from your sister university to the north. I went to SDSU as an undergraduate. Back when it meant a little bit more, this is back in the day when frozen coyotes and jackrabbits were thrown on fields of play every game at Hooper Day and Dakota Days. But anyway, so I feel better getting that off my chest. Anyway, between a couple of professors at State and Bob and my professor at University of Texas, I've been very lucky to have mentors that made me, turned me from a history buff into a historian and from a chronicler into a writer. And I think especially here, giving me the confidence to go on and go to get a PhD. I taught high school in Iowa for a couple of years, and I didn't quite know what I was going to be doing. And it worked out pretty well here, so thanks, Bob. I'm here to talk about Union veterans, and as a generation set apart. And that sounds more, I think, positive than it often was. And what I want to do tonight is going to be very much a survey of several experiences that I think certain groups of veterans shared. They certainly were a generation after the Civil War. Something like 41% of all the white men in the North, born between 1822 and 1845, served in the Union Army. It rises to something like 60% for those born in the late 1830s, and to like 80% of men born after 1840 or so. And so this very much is the most typical experience of a white man in the North after the Civil War. They were certainly set apart, and tonight I'm going to talk about some of the ways in which they were set apart. They certainly knew they were set apart. One of the most famous representations, I think, of that apartness that they felt came in the words of a future Supreme Court justice. If you're a Civil War person, you've heard this phrase many times. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who himself was a thrice wounded veteran of the war, gave a talk in 1884 to a post of the Grand Army of the Republic, that's the main veterans organization for Civil War soldiers, in Keene, New Hampshire. It's a long talk, and at one point he says, "Through our great good fortune in our youth, our hearts were touched with fire." The favorite phrase of every historian is using titles, all the time. I'm sure you've heard it, some version of that sometime. "It was given to us to learn at the outset that life is a profound and passionate thing. While we are permitted to score nothing but indifference and do not pretend to undervalue the worldly rewards of ambition, we have seen with our own eyes the snowy heights of honor, and it is for us to bear the report to those who come after us." Now, this is kind of the famous part of that passage. He goes on to kind of explain how a Civil War veteran had a different outlook and had different experiences on which to draw their ideas about life. "You see a battery of guns go by at a trot, and for a moment you're back at White Oak Swamp or Antietam, two battles in which he was wounded, or on the Jerusalem Road. You hear a few shots in the distance, and for an instant your heart stops as you say to yourself, 'The skirmishers are at it,' and listen for the long roll of fire from the main line." This is 20 years after they fired the last shots in anger, and he, like other veterans, he admitted, when they met, they started with talk, they'd shake hands. They didn't talk about their families or careers as most men would, but about such terrible and manly moments as, quote, "when you were nearly surrounded by the enemy, and again there comes up to you that swift and cunning thinking on which once hung life or freedom. Shall I stand the best chance if I try the pistol or the saber on that man who means to stop me?" In another passage, Holmes cataloged the members of his generation of Boston aristocrats who did not survive the war. Those men with names like Cabot and Putnam and Lowell and Revere and Abbott. He recalled a scene from the 7 Days battles outside Richmond, the last time he saw James J. Lowell alive. "When I looked down the line at the officers, the head of their companies, the advance was beginning. We caught each other's eye and saluted. When next I looked, he was gone." Of course, this old soldier, he was all of 43, which doesn't sound very old to me these days, was talking to other old soldiers. But the civilians of the audience would have realized that Holmes was setting out differences between those who had fought in the war and those who had not. Very self-aware that they are a separate group. A very different tone of this separateness comes from the son of a veteran, a very different veteran than Holmes. Sherwood Anderson, the short story writer and novelist in the early 20th century's father was a Civil War veteran. Sherwood Anderson wrote Winesburg, Ohio, and other cynical and very kind of negative tales. And his father was a ne'er-do-well veteran who had never been in combat, had not had a very distinguished career, but had kind of made made a life out of being a veteran, kind of professional veteran after the war. He gave little performances of songs and stories and so forth. Anderson, the writer, talked about his veteranizing, his father's veteranizing. In his memoirs, Anderson offered an unsparing and impatient portrait of his irresponsible father, an irrepressible comrade, that he also wrote with some empathy of his father's realization that after leaving the Army and starting a family, he would never be a hero again, and that all the rest of his life would never measure up to those few years of his youth. The war, what Anderson called that universal, passionate, death-spitting thing, would have to last a lifetime. And given his profound inability to make a consistent living, the only thing elevating Anderson Sr. Above a semi-employed laborer was that experience of having served in the war. And so tonight I want to talk about some ways in which veterans were separate and separated themselves as a generation. Actually, this is a kind of a famous Currier and Ives print, the Veteran Returns, I believe is what it's called. And it looks pretty cheerful. You know, he's back home and the family's welcoming him to the hearth and so forth. But even this, I was just looking at this today and thought of this. He's set apart. For one thing, he's been an officer. He's been a leader on the battlefield, very different than most people's experiences. He's been wounded. How many people have been wounded in battle, outside of Civil War veterans? He's been to exotic places as shown, and you can't quite see it well by the African-American boy who's come home with him. He's had a very different experience than anybody else in this huge family that is now sort of flocking to gather around him. And that's some of what I want to talk about along the way tonight. Well, one way in which veterans separated themselves was to organize. I mentioned the GAR before. The GAR was the American Legion of the 19th century in many ways. It was limited, of course, just to Union veterans. Some veterans had their own, the United Confederate Veterans. There are many other groups, in fact, the United Veterans Legion, and there are many others. But this was the main one. And by the 1880s, 1890s, about 500,000 men belonged to the GAR in any given year. It was a major political force, a social force. You see the old guys sort of gathered in Atlantic City for a reunion. This is the program sponsored by Pabst Brewing Company in Milwaukee, the national reunion or encampment, as they called them, in the 1880s. There are thousands of posts of the GAR scattered around the United States. In South Dakota, I just happened to look up online the other night, 164 different posts, various places. In Vermilion, it was the minor post. The posts were usually named after a local soldier or perhaps not local, but a better known one. Probably the most famous name attached to the most famous post, I would think, in South Dakota is in Gettysburg. Gettysburg is named after the Battle of Gettysburg. About 200 men, Union veterans, homesteaded or settled in Gettysburg and named their town after the battle that most of them had fought in at one point or another. And they named their post after George Gordon Meade, who was the commander of the Potomac at Gettysburg. And there are many other posts along there, too. All of these posts had local reunions, state reunions, national reunions every year. And so guys would some of you might be veterans. Your units might have reunions now. It's a way to reacquaint yourselves with comrades, to tell stories, to celebrate, commemorate, remember, the past. My understanding of modern reunions of the military is families are often invited. I have a former student whose father was on the USS Tennessee at Pearl Harbor, and they have reunions all the time. They have another one apparently next year. And the families always go along, with these. And GAR reunions were no different. There was always a Friday night campfire, they called it. And it might be a real fire. Mainly it was a gathering at which they'd serve good old soldiers' food, they'd say, beans and hardtack and coffee. Hardtack is a hard cracker made out of water and flour, basically. And they'd tell stories. Sometimes it really was just telling stories. Other times it'd be very formal addresses made by soldiers, officers, and privates alike. But the reunions, even as they welcome family, wives, children, grandkids, ultimately members of the community. In fact, it became really big events for cities to raise money. You could make hundreds of thousands of dollars by that. Thousands of people coming into a town for a GAR national encampment. So people really competed for those conventions. But it also, they were set apart. They were being celebrated for being veterans because they were veterans. And this is kind of a bland thing to say in a way, but it's the most obvious way that Americans saw veterans as being separate. A somewhat different but related way in which they separated themselves was through their newspapers. There are at least 20 or 25 veterans newspapers published after the Civil War. These were often published by GAR or social GAR units in certain states. I have a picture of the neighbors, an ad for the Neighbors Home Mail, which was a newspaper published in upstate New York by a Union veteran. Now, I highlight this because Holmes's quote talks about his memories of certain events and instances that he experienced that other people didn't. Soldiers' newspapers, sometimes were just regular newspapers. The Milwaukee Sunday Messenger was really a weekly paper that had lots of news in it, with about 2 pages devoted to veterans' news and stories. Others were entirely about veterans' experiences. But they were part of veterans insisting that all of their stories were worth telling. They had stories to tell that no one else had to tell. It could be an account of the second day at Gettysburg. It could be an account of a little skirmish between 5 guys and a picket line in Virginia in the dark. Nothing was too small. No story was too unimportant. All veterans had equal access to those stories. And the way that the newspapers advertised themselves, I think, is really interesting. This is a time of booming in your advertising. You really push yourself onto the public. Neighbors Home Mail, this pretty long-running newspaper for soldiers, tried to convince veterans to subscribe. "Rally on the colors, men," he wrote. He asked them to recall the last words of gallant comrades, the shattered silence as survivors drank coffee and chewed hardtack after a bloody battle, the poignancy of everything rang. So he really called out the ghosts of military service and said, "Remember all this? Yes, thrice times yes, and in the most sacred cherishings of fond memory will ever live these realities. Comrades, rally round the Home Mail. It is doing a noble work. Every surviving soldier has an interest in its mission." So the call for subscribers became a call to be patriotic, to support the mission of getting the soldiers' stories into print. And this becomes an era between the 1880s and the turn of the century of thousands of memoirs being published, tens of thousands of articles being published in magazines and newspapers. It's the most common kind of story to be told, and it's told by this generation, becomes this generation's way of communicating with the generations that come after it. And it's a kind of an obvious way, I think, of setting themselves apart, to organize into groups, to tell their stories, but it's the most common one at the same time. I just had to give you these pictures. Veterans didn't always have a control over how they were separate. They become, in some ways, a very identifiable generation and are used a lot in advertisements. And so you have, on the far left, the ad of 2 old soldiers, one Union, one Confederate, investigating a new officer, and this is like 19-teens, his Colt revolver, and approvingly looking at that. A veteran helping to sell tires, and apparently giving a guy courtship advice, I believe, there in the second one from the left. Veteran brand coffee and vegetables. On the far lower left, you have a veteran's cigar label. There's no reason to think veterans had anything to do with any of these products, but they're using the brand to promote these products. This is an ad for a sprinkler company, like fire sprinklers. And you have an old soldier rescuing another old soldier out of a soldier's home because they didn't have the sprinklers that allowed them. And suggesting that these old soldiers are heroes and you can't always rely on them to be around when you need them when a fire breaks out. And I just want to show some kind of peculiar souvenirs revolving around veterans. These are all knickknacks you can buy at soldiers' homes that I'll mention in a minute. But some of these truly ugliest things you'll ever see. How this suggests anything about a soldier's home in the Civil War, I do not know. But it was, or the little boot, kind of slayed me. The one I think up in the middle is from Hot Springs. That's in Ohio, I guess. Anyway, Hot Springs, South Dakota had a federal home as well, ultimately, that I have a plate from there that I bought. So this is part of a larger issue of veterans being commercialized, especially being put into the booming souvenir industry of the late 19th century. They also have metal spoons and things like this that relate to veterans issues. So that's kind of a sidebar in a way, but it's another way that they become identifiable in the way that celebrities can be identifiable in some ways. And it's a very different kind of experience for Americans at the time. A much narrower group of veterans. Another way in which some were set apart was the presence of a number of disabled veterans in society. Something like 60,000 men had limbs amputated and survived during the Civil War. Again, if you know anything about the Civil War, you know that the kinds of rifle balls used were very heavy. They traveled slowly. If they hit a body, they expanded and they shattered bones. And so there was just really no way of repairing those limbs. And of course, without antibiotics, there's no way of preventing infection or dealing with it afterwards. And so amputation became, especially in a battlefield hospital, kind of the best hope for saving lives. And so amputation becomes the one-legged, one-armed soldier become the most obvious examples of this very kind of subgroup of veterans within this generation set apart. There are tens of thousands of other veterans disabled in other ways. In fact, most disabilities after the Civil War had nothing to do with combat. It had to do with chronic dysentery, having had measles or malaria during the war and never recovering from that, having eye problems or kidney problems, or just general malaise that was very hard to identify, hard to diagnose, but clearly understood by the veterans themselves and by the late 1890s by doctors. You know, it just seems to me that we have these 50-year-old men that ought to be just fine, but they just can't keep up. They can't do their jobs. They don't seem to have the pep, that's the word they'd be using, the pep, that most men their age do. And veterans knew what they're talking about. They just hadn't quite gotten over those 3 years on cold ground and hard rain and snow and the 30-mile marches and the bad diet and everything else that went into being a soldier took a cumulative toll on them that wore them down over time. We have several very different images of disabled veterans here. These are all amputees that show, I think, very different points of view about them. On the far left, this is one of thousands of pictures taken of amputees by the medical department in the U.S. Army. In fact, there was a medical museum was created by the Army in Washington. It exists in a different form now. And included there are not only photographs of the men who show everything. I mean, he happens just to need to take his shirt off. Men with other kinds of amputations, it's very revealing and very un-Victorian, what they're showing here. And they have a sign with the name and what's wrong with them and so forth. This is very much a clinical approach. There had never been so many disabled people in America as in the years right after the Civil War. This museum was meant to be a way to study these wounds. So they become subjects of research. And a multi-volume work is published about how to deal with gunshot wounds and knife wounds and things like this that are still being used during World War I by Army doctors. And so one way that they're set apart is that they're subjects of research in ways that really hadn't happened before. In addition to the photographs, they actually kept specimens of amputated limbs and wounds of various kinds that could be studied by doctors after this time. And so that's a little gruesome, but it's absolutely an important part of the memory of the war for these guys. Very different approach, and this is sort of how veterans appeared in pop culture in many ways. There's two cartoons at the top, both from Harpers magazine. On the left, we have a man with a crutch. I think he's missing a leg. It's a little unclear, begging from a woman and a child. In fact, that was a very common sight in northern southern cities too. In the years immediately after the Civil War, becomes kind of a stereotype, which is really challenged Americans. You know, we don't really care for begging in the United States. This isn't just now; it goes back a long ways. And we certainly believe we take care of our soldiers just fine, but having them on the streets begging reflects poorly in both of us, both the soldiers and on society. But here you go, you know, and you kind of see, I think, in the story that accompanies this picture, it's actually a positive thing, because he looks pretty clean, he's very polite, and the little girl in the carriage learns a good lesson from it. On the next picture is also from Harpers Weekly, another amputee who's selling shoelaces on the streets. And so one way that, you know, this is sort of this kind of begging without really begging. You're selling people something they don't really need. And where he got the shoelaces, I don't know. But you can help a guy out, you know. It's like selling apples in the Depression or something like this. It's just a way of begging without asking for charity. And that was a very, you see the sign behind him, if you can, wounded at Gettysburg. You know, and I'm not just any old disabled person, I'm a soldier. I'm disabled because of that. The two pictures down here below could not be more different. You have here the old soldier on the left. This is Memorial Day, actually a GAR postcard for Memorial Day. The little medal in the upper right-hand corner, the GAR insignia. With a grandfather missing an arm with his sleeve very tastefully pinned behind him, and his granddaughter. And she's like putting a poppy, you know, like this must be near World War I suppose, poppy in his lapel. And this is also a postcard. This is a really grotesque picture to me. But it's like a guy had a picture taken of himself, and he sells these to make money, you know. So he's really kind of putting himself out there as a disabled guy. He has no legs, and this is how he gets around. He gets pushed around by somebody else. And these are, again, different ways of looking at these disabilities. And in public and in the writing and popular culture of the time, there are very different ways. This is actually right as the war ends, a short story appeared in Harpers Weekly about a young man who's, you know, from the polite set in New England, who loses an arm. And he goes to, you know, he doesn't really know, he's a little disaffected. He doesn't quite know how his friends are going to respond. He goes to Newport, Rhode Island, where, of course, all the elite go from that time for the summer. And he's right. He should never have gone. The men who hadn't been in the Army are kind of jaunty and rich and have two arms. And the women have taken to racing horses up and down the beach, which isn't very ladylike. And he sees his girlfriend from before the war racing a carriage up and down the beach. Oh my gosh, she's changed. I've changed. She'll never have me back. He's very sad. Finally, he confronts her, and he sort of says this to her. And so, I mean, the story here is how hard it is for him to adjust to life with one arm. And it's his right arm that he's lost. And she says, no, that's not what I mean. I'm learning how to drive so that when we go courting, I can help you drive the carriage. So it's a very happy ending. But in that happy ending is this adjustment process of having to, that thousands of men have to accomplish. And this is something our newspapers are filled with these sorts of things these days, with men and women coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq. Having to adjust to prosthetics and things like this, and to make their lives over again. And that was very much a part of pop culture after the Civil War, another way of them being set apart. Another way that soldiers were set apart was in the way that they were treated by the government. There are two policies created for Union veterans that foreshadowed 20th century, welfare efforts. One was a series of homes that were set up by the federal government beginning in, 1867, really. In fact, one of the first three homes is the one down here in the lower right-hand corner. I live about 5 minutes from Milwaukee. The National Home for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers is what this was called. That's the seal for it right there in the seal, where you have a soldier shaking hands with Lady Liberty. And the homes were established to care for men who could not support themselves and whose families could not support them. This is the first time this had ever been done on a large basis. There was a very small soldiers' home outside Washington, D.C., which, again, if you're into the Civil War, you might notice where Lincoln hung out in the summers quite often during the war. But it was only for professional soldiers who'd been in the Army like for 30 years. So this is really just for old soldiers that were ready to die. The soldiers' homes under the national system here were really for guys who were 22, 24, 30 years old who were disabled. And the system grows to include about ultimately 11 homes around the country. And in those homes, they were meant to find a safe place to flourish, to be celebrated, to be cared for. And that in and of itself made them a very separate, generation. The first group ever supported in any way by the federal government. And in many ways, it was a very positive thing. In Milwaukee, for instance, the homes are virtually all of them turned into Veterans Administration facilities in 1930. And so the VA hospital in Milwaukee is just down the hill from this and about 20 other 1880s buildings near the baseball stadium, in fact, in Milwaukee. But back then, it was about a half hour out of town. And this is a site where 4th of July was held for Milwaukee. And so like 60,000 people would go out there for 4th of July. Fireworks and dances. There were 3 lakes out there, forests, there were swans and bears. The veterans were kind of beside the point in a way, but the home became a place where people could express and show their patriotism and appreciation for this generation of soldiers. And that was the case at state homes as well. Virtually every northern state established its own soldiers' home. This is the cover for a pamphlet for a fundraiser for the Massachusetts Soldiers' Home in the late 1860s, 1880s rather. I mentioned the Hot Springs Home. That started out as a state home and became a federal home later on here in Dakota Territories when it started. And the state homes were smaller versions of the federal homes in that way, that they were tourist attractions. They're gorgeous places. People would flock there to see them. But a sign of respect and appreciation and a way to sort of protect the veterans. Unfortunately, and this is another way in which veterans were set apart, these are guys living in homes by themselves without families. And one of the chronic problems with these homes is that they're bored. They have nothing to do. Again, they're referred to as old soldiers. I referred to this when I talk about homes. They're referred to as old soldiers like in 1867. They're not old at all. They're very young guys. And in the 1870s and 80s and 90s, they do what guys do. And all around these homes popped up areas with bars and brothels and places like this. Outside the soldiers' home near Leavenworth was a tiny village of only 31-story frame houses called Klondike. Almost all of them were whiskey saloons, gambling houses, or dens of the grossest immorality, according to one observer. The equivalent row of dives and bars near the Togus main branch of the NHDVS struggled down a road called Hayseed Avenue. Outside the central branch of the home in Dayton, the vast collection of bars and brothels was simply called the West Side. By the 1990s, over 30 bars clustered near the northern and southern entrances to the northwestern branch in Milwaukee, with 17 crowded into one little 2-block stretch of what was called National Avenue, named after the national home. Sometimes the bars were little dives with catchy names like Lincoln and Sheridan and Sherman. Others were just dens of iniquity that you'd stumble into and to have a drink. One resident veteran wrote disapprovingly to his son that these bars were filled with old soldiers from morning to night, while a Kansan complained that the Klondike drew vile women and men to prey on these men, to drug them, thug them, and rob them. Now, the problem with this is there's disciplinary. The most common problem at the homes is drunkenness and disorderly conduct and violence, and hundreds of men, thousands of men every year are disciplined for this. They're put into jail. They're assigned to work extra hours in the brush pile or the junk pile. They're kicked out of the homes. They're under sort of a modified form of military justice. And so discipline was really something they thought about a lot at these places. But it also reflected badly on soldiers. One resident of Milwaukee, or actually a Milwaukee newspaper, highlighted the problem with the public perception of the inmates, who, if we are correctly informed, they wrote, are too much in the habit of overindulgence in drink. If they are frequently seen intoxicated in the city, they will surely create the impression that rather strict discipline is needed at the home. They'll lose the support of the citizenry. Every man of them who gets drunk brings disrepute upon associates, demonstrating to the public that the inmates of the home are a hard lot, to cause people to discredit reports that they are too severely dealt with. In other words, seeing any drunken old soldier in the street meant all old soldiers were drunks. This becomes very much a stereotype for veterans. And so in a certain way, both in the positive way of these kindly old gentlemen put aside in a safe place in the home, but also in the very negative way of old drunks who can't take care of themselves, they're also set apart as a generation in ways that were very public, and because of their place as veterans, as wards of the country, in fact, they're very visible because of that, and it leads to very negative stereotypes as well. Well, the other system that is created for the pensions that's unprecedented in the scale to which it was created was the pension system. Now, again, there have been pensions for soldiers after every war of some kind. Revolutionary War veterans started getting their pensions in the 1820s and 30s. There are pensions for Mexican War veterans in the 1860s and 70s. And the pensions are based on disability. So if you lose an arm, you get a certain pension every year. If you lose your life, your widow or your orphans get pensions. The pension system begins in 1861. It's tweaked a number of times over the years. At one point, there's something called the Arrears Act, which I won't go into all details about that, but allows a lot more men to apply for pensions. The real change occurs in 1890 when you did not, again, ostensibly, you're receiving a pension for injuries received in the line of duty in the Civil War. Well, what happens in 1890 is that you get a pension because you are disabled and are a veteran, not because you were wounded in the war. And so anybody who served at least 9 months of any kind of service was eligible to apply for a pension if they could show need and disability. Ultimately, old age becomes a disability under the rules. And so by the end of the 19th century, the average recipient was receiving $160 a year, which doesn't sound like much, but that can support you, actually, at a very low level for a year, especially if you're living in a home, because you still got your pension if you're living in a home funded by the state or federal government. In 1915, there were still 400,000 veterans alive. Over 90% of them were getting a pension. Ultimately, pensions become the number one expense of the Civil War. It's like 7 times as much money is spent on pensions as was actually spent on the war itself. And if you were paying attention, you probably noticed, I don't know how many years ago it was now, when the last widow died, getting a pension from a Civil War. It kind of creeps you out if you think about it too much. But, I think they're all gone now, if I'm not mistaken. But clearly a very young woman marrying a very old man and receiving his pension when he died. Well, this is something that we'd expect. We're people my dad used the GI Bill, and father-in-law. And we have lots of programs for veterans now. We have a welfare system. We have workman's comp. We have all these entitlement programs that are very controversial these days in politics, but which did not exist in any way, shape, or form in 1865. The pension system for soldiers becomes the first and really forerunner of our current Social Security system, basically. And I guess in many ways, Medicaid kind of can go back to that. This makes it very controversial. No one denies that disabled veterans who lost an arm in the war should get a pension. That's not controversial. What becomes controversial, and it is very politicized, is when a guy who's had dysentery for a few years and can't quite work, but it's unclear where that came from, gets a pension as well. Becomes controversial when attorneys, a whole new industry, a whole new business called being a pension attorney pops up. You don't need to have an attorney to file a pension claim, but they're very complicated. Again, if you do genealogy with Civil War soldiers, you might have looked at a pension file. It can be this thick because you apply for it, you get affidavits from doctors. It's a kind of a complicated form that you have to fill out, like any government form. And you reapply for increases if your disability gets worse. It can go on and on and on. And so it's helpful to have a pension attorney who get paid by the head and a percentage sometimes. And hundreds of guys are pension attorneys. And they're the ones that seem to, in the public mind, are pushing for more and bigger pensions. The illustrations we have on this page are two very different versions of images of pensions. This is the pension building in Washington. It was built to house the pension office. Now it's the National Building Museum in Washington. It's been restored. It's a great red brick building. It's just a beautiful thing, not far from Union Station in Washington. And going around the top of it, just above that third course of windows, is this bas relief sculpture, which this is a part of, which is really just soldiers marching. There are also some sailors and cavalrymen, but they're mainly marching soldiers. This is a segment of wounded guys marching with them. It's sort of the image of this stately building, the federal government, taking care of the men who had fought in the war, a statue representing them very accurately and meaningfully and respectfully. This is one version of what pensions were for, to celebrate, to commemorate, to take care of the veterans. These are magazine attacks on the pension system. The first one here, you have Uncle Sam feeding the white elephant, the pension system, who's got, sort of a military cap on. It's clearly the Union veteran being fed here. $160 million yearly, it's saying, which is actually low. It gets much higher than that later on. This other one, I don't know if you can read this. It says The Insatiable Glutton. And it's a Union veteran with the many different arms. You can't read it on the spoons. It says, pension agent, fraudulent grandparent, fraudulent veteran. The criticism is that there are many fake veterans and lots of lies being told and people exploiting the system at the expense of the taxpayer. To the extent that Democratic opponents of the pension system could write something like this. Grover Cleveland, the only non-veteran to serve as president between the Civil War and the 20th century, vetoed a number of pension bills. And when he vetoes one really big one in 1888, the Chicago Tribune, which hated the pension system, wrote, "Thank God, the claim agents, the demagogues, the deadbeats and deserters, and coffee coolers and bounty jumpers, composing our great standing army of volunteer mendicants, have been defeated." The Tribune refuted the claim that veterans had saved the country. No country, no nation, political constitution, system, or establishment has ever been saved by citizens that are not in the habit of depending on themselves. So saying if you're truly a veteran and Soldier, you rely on yourself for support later on. Indeed, the army of pension beggars were more dangerous enemies of the nation than undisguised rebels. Ex-rebels, deprived of the opportunity of living off government pensions, had become thrifty, hard-working, respectable men. The majority of Union veterans, on the other hand, encouraged by Republican Party demagogues, had been, quote, indoctrinated with the pestilent notion that it is becoming to a savior of its country to fulfill the character of a dependent upon its bounty, of a pauper without character or self-respect. Amazingly, the story ended with a kind of epitaph. It will be a happy day for the Republic when the last beggar of the Grand Army humbug is securely planted. Most Americans would not have agreed with that. But that anyone could think of saying this suggests something about the distinctions civilians and veterans made between and among themselves. This is an extreme version, although he's not the only. Democrats would say things like this a lot. Their point was that the guys that are really pushing for pensions weren't really good soldiers after all. They were the coffee coolers in the back lines, the rear echelon, the sutlers, the wagon drivers, people that weren't really saving the Union, as the real soldiers would never ask for these things. But they go on to say, but they're casting a very bad shadow over all veterans. And the GAR is the worst among them. Another editorial, different newspaper, compared GAR members to ladies of the night, prostituted themselves for pensions. So there's pretty negative portrayals of veterans because of this pension system and distinguishing veterans from civilians. Well, kind of wrapping all this up is a man that I've just started doing some work on, Corporal Tanner. Has anyone heard of Corporal James Tanner? Historians have never heard of him either. I'd never heard of him until I did the book about veterans. If you had asked someone in 1884 or so who the corporal was, well, that's James Tanner. Everyone knew who Corporal Tanner was. He was this is him in the 1880s. I'll get to this one in a minute. James Tanner, as an 18-year-old corporal, lost parts of both legs at Second Manassas, just below the knee. And he goes home to upstate New York. He learns how to walk on very bad he never is able actually to walk by himself again. He has surgery a couple times. He's in constant pain for 40 years. But he learns stenography. He becomes a lawyer. He gets married all within a few years. He works at the War Department. He has a very early brush with fame. He has an apartment in Washington just across the street from Ford's Theater. And when a certain president goes to a certain play and gets shot, he's taken to the apartment next to Tanner's. And a cry goes out for a stenographer. Of course, the first thing you think of with a wounded president is a stenographer. But if you know anything about these, you know that the Secretary of War started doing the investigation immediately, at the deathbed. Tanner knew stenography, and so he's at the deathbed for a number of hours that night, writing down the testimony of people in shorthand. And it becomes his little brief brush with fame. But later on, he becomes famous for himself because he's disabled. He becomes a Republican operative and office holder. He's the collector of taxes in Brooklyn. He's the registrar of deeds. And these are sinecures, for loyal Republican veterans. He, as an attorney, becomes one of the very first and richest pension attorneys in the country. Now, he himself is collecting $50 a month. He lost both legs, and also represents hundreds of men in their cases for pensions. For a while, he is commissioner of pensions in Washington for all of 9 months in 1889. When he became commissioner, he supposedly said, and he never claims to have said it, God help the surplus, because he was going to ramp up the pension system. And he did, until he was fired. In fact, this cartoon from Puck, which is the sort of the National Lampoon of the 1880s and 90s, shows him, and I think it's really interesting. This is a guy who lost parts of both legs. They got him standing up, but his legs are covered, with his toga, basically. But the playing the cornucopia, going back into the pension building, he's throwing the coins out, to willy-nilly to anybody really who wants the money. At the same time, he becomes famous as a speaker about the war. He gives talks at GAR reunions throughout the country, large and small, at church gatherings. He's on the Chautauqua circuit. He has an agent that puts him out everywhere. He campaigns for presidents all over the country. He becomes perhaps the most famous veteran, aside from generals and presidents, most famous veteran in the United States. And so there's sort of two sides of Corporal Tanner going here. You have, again, the brave soldier who suffered greatly, and no one denied that. When he goes into surgery in the 1890s, it's front page news in a lot of newspapers. The corporal is resting comfortably, they'll say, after they amputate a little bit more of both of his legs, and they follow that pretty closely. He becomes the commander of the National GAR in 1905. Not a lot of enlisted men become commander of the National GAR. He's beloved by many people, while at the same time he's a lightning rod for criticism about the pension, about preference in hiring soldiers. It's another policy that many governments form. And he kind of reflects the ambiguity with which Americans approached veterans because of their sort of separate status. In many ways, he becomes famous because he was different. Now, I think we tend to think of veterans at that time or ours as being part of the community. It's probably easier when you have, like as in the Civil War, a volunteer army that serves in regiments from your state, from your locality. It's probably easier today when you have so many National Guard and Reserve units that are locally organized and so forth. So you can kind of see those people as being a part of the community. But they are set apart. The most famous resident of Benzonia, Michigan, Bruce Catton, who, again, if you're a Civil War buff, you know Bruce Catton. He wrote a lot of very famous books with Civil War. The ones that made me a Civil War story in the 1950s and 60s, certainly, were written by Bruce Catton. And he wrote about the old soldiers in his little town, Michigan, as being men set apart. On formal occasions, they wore blue uniforms with brass buttons and black campaign hats, he wrote. By the time Catton knew them, most had long gray beards, which helped them project an unassuming natural dignity. They were pillars of the community, the keepers of its patriotic traditions, the living embodiment, so to speak, of what it most deeply believed about the nation's greatness and high destiny. Catton and other young boys who saw them march on Memorial Day looked at these men in blue, existing in pensioned security, honored and respected by all, moving past the mounded graves with their little flags and their heaps of lilacs, and we were in awe of them. The terrible names out of the history books, Gettysburg, Shiloh, Stones River, Cold Harbor, came alive through these men. They had been there, and now they stood by the GAR monument in the cemetery and listened to the orations and prayers and the patriotic songs, and to watch them was to be deeply moved. I think veterans of any time are set apart. They, like Catton's veterans and like the veterans coming home today from wars and wars any time, can only, as in Holmes's words, bear the report of their deeds and their experiences to those who come after them. And I don't think I'm saying anything that's unusual about veterans by talking about Civil War veterans this way. I am, however, suggesting that we have never thought about veterans of the Civil War quite in this way. I think it's very common for us to think about Vietnam veterans as being very complicated, and we know for sure that coming home from our wars today is very complicated to readjust, especially if you've been wounded. I think we even know more about World War II veterans having a harder adjustment and having more difficult lives afterwards. But I think it's also important for us to know that Civil War veterans have shared those same experiences. Thanks for coming. Sure. Any questions? Yeah. Uh-huh.
beginning. Within recent decades, you can find things, commodities that focus or centered or around, veterans or soldiers or, war, things like that. However, I haven't noticed or I couldn't see that it's the majority. It's the minority of items that are within the entire spectrum. Would you say that at that time it was something that would also be like, an equivalent percentage as today? Or, was it something that was over-encompassing almost all commodities?
Oh, no, it wasn't like there's a whole bunch of it. It's pretty visible, though. No, I'm not saying this is like an overwhelming percentage of advertising. And I wouldn't even hazard a guess, I was just stunned how many things popped up on eBay. Do Civil War better than eBay? This is what you get, these sorts of things. It says, weirdest research I've ever done, for a project is on eBay. But it's incredible how many different things you could buy that were souvenirs like the Soldiers' Home things, or just these advertisements. Most of those showed up on eBay too. Anything else? Yeah.
To go to your question of pensions, it's kind of interesting if you look at what happened on Capitol Hill during that period in politics of it. Grover Cleveland was one of the first presidents to exercise the veto like crazy, and a lot of his vetoes for the individual pension
Yeah.
requests of the members of Congress who serve them up, knowing the president's going to veto them, but can take the credit that they went to bat for the widow and the child. And the Congress itself will develop the appropriations committees, partly in response to trying to keep a lid on federal expenditures as a result of this whole pension problem. And so from the Hill side, it really magnifies or amplifies or complements what you were talking about when you were talking about pensions, because this is a very real issue.
Friday night was pension night on the Hill, and there'd be dozens of bills and like 10 guys there, and they would suspend the rules about having a quorum, and they just kind of whoop them through. You're right. He did veto hundreds of these things, and then just come back the next session and have someone else pass them. Because if you didn't qualify under the rules, you could petition Congress for a separate one. It actually was a pretty cynical business in certain ways. Anything else? Yeah.
I've noticed some other cases where the veterans themselves felt very alienated from the society that they returned to, and there was a certain amount of contempt for civilians, for people who didn't serve in the war, but thought they knew everything about it, and the veterans had a sense that you don't know anything about this, and was there any of that you found? And was there, and part of this too, did the veterans write anything? Is there any literature by the veterans that reflects their attitude toward the society they returned to?
I'll answer this. I had Dr. Price too while I was here. Actually, the second part first. They don't write about being a veteran much, And the kind of contempt you're referring to, what they would write about mainly is how unfair it was that guys that stayed back and didn't fight got ahead during the war. It wasn't so much that civilians were talking about the war like they knew anything, because they kind of ignored the war in some ways. Let the veterans talk about the war. But there was a real sense among the veterans, really from the very beginning, that they'd lost out on 3 or 4 of the best years of their lives, and they were never going to catch up, because in the northern economy, it really boomed during the war. Little downturn afterwards, but then it picked up again. And I mentioned sort of that long-term cumulative, vague kind of disability that veterans felt. They blamed that too. But the main contempt they felt was for those men that stay at home. There's in the campaign of was 84 the first year Cleveland won? 84? I think that's the one. They actually showed him in in diaper and a baby outfit. And who'd be running against in 84? Who knows? Anyway, some Republican who was a Civil War officer, in the uniform marching off to the front. They did the same thing William Jennings Bryan later on, that they showed them as little boys and immature. And the Republican as being the adult. And serving their country. And so the real divide is over, again, the wartime, the benefit of not having fought, not so much that they were assuming more about the war than they knew, I think. So it's a little bit different than what you suggested.
Did any of the black soldiers get pensions?
They all did, yeah. I mean, they were certainly eligible for them in the same way that white soldiers are eligible. The pension and the home, actually the GAR were colorblind officially. They actually didn't record in the GAR members who were black. So it's really actually, there's a new book that just came out this summer about black members of the GAR. And it was really kind of hard to find them, because oddly, at that time, you kind of think of the 1970s, that's race is everything. The GAR is not so much. Pensions, I'm not sure. I looked at a few pension files, and I don't know that it actually asked for race there. I don't know how it was executed, because there were some local elements to this. And if you're living in the South and you're an African American, it's a federal project. I wouldn't doubt there's some discrimination, but they're certainly eligible, and many of them did get pensions. So yes. Anything else?
Well, was there any effort to do oral histories like we're doing the World War II people now? Was there any effort to do that for Civil War veterans?
No. What they did do, there was one in Tennessee. There's a veterans questionnaires that they sent out. And this wouldn't be for Union veterans in Tennessee, obviously, although we're actually, there's a volume of Union veterans from Tennessee that answered this. But it's mainly people getting Confederate pensions from Tennessee. They sent out questionnaires with it was a bunch of questions, 50, 60 questions, mainly about wartime service. Also like what their job was before the war, it's really kind of sophisticated things they're asking. And they received thousands of responses. So the Tennessee Veterans Questionnaire is kind of this famous thing that's still on file. I was told, and they're published actually, and so they're very easy to use, and they tell you a lot. So that's along those lines. Apparently, and I was just told this not too long ago, New York did one of those too, but they lost those in a fire, so they don't exist anymore. But no, there's no systematic attempt to capture those stories as such. Yeah. They received their pensions from the states, and they were tiny. They were like $40 a year instead of $160. There are Confederate soldiers' homes in all of the Confederate states, plus Kentucky and Oklahoma. Well, yeah, and I think Maryland had one too. So but they're also very small, a few dozen men usually. And they have all the same problems that Union soldiers have. However, I would argue, and I do, that Confederate soldiers become kind of statues. The criticism that is about with their pensions and just the complicated perception of veterans doesn't apply in the South. They were gold. They had persevered despite hardship and loss. They were the living representatives of the lost cause in the South. You could not criticize a Confederate because of their being a veteran. Make it something else, But if they're a veteran, that's all you need to say. And there are certainly individual examples in which a veteran was not treated very well, and that's when they were drunks, and just like they weren't all drunks, but there were certainly some that were drunks, because again they had the same thing. But the South also, had a terrible economy during this time. The North was the go-go, 80s and 90s, and if you fell behind, it was your own fault. In the South, everyone had fallen behind. And so you didn't have some of the social and economic things going on that kind of made Union veterans stick out. And they also weren't getting those big pensions, from the government, and so that eliminated one possible source, of conflict. So there is a huge difference in the perception. very similar experiences personally for veterans, but a very different experience, I think, in the perception. Yeah.
Is there any generalizations or anything that can be said about the veterans becoming pioneers of heading west? You mentioned Gettysburg being settled by hundreds of veterans. I have a great-grandfather who was a Civil War vet. He homesteaded in western Iowa after the war. I always grew up thinking of those guys coming back from the war heading west.
A lot of them did, but I did not do that. It's the sort of thing that would be a different kind of. This took a long time to write, and I was doing other things too. I really thought I was going to do that as part of it, and I just didn't. That certainly is anecdotally a very common thing. I have no clue. They weren't treated differently than other immigrants necessarily. There were some, I think, land programs that they could benefit from that others couldn't, but generally speaking, they did the same homesteading and the same thing everybody else did, so it would be hard to track it without going through every single census in every state to find out where they came from. Certainly, if you just look at Union veterans, where they're buried, this is what genealogical websites can tell you, There are lots of them out there. They came from all over, but to actually get a concrete hold on how many went would be beyond me. So the short answer is no, but certainly that is a very common cultural belief that veterans really go west. Confederate veterans too do that.
I wonder if it's a fair comparison, because back in the 1860s, it was small-town America supporting big army during the Civil War. Small towns drafting companies of soldiers, sending them en masse to go fight. And was it then those same small towns that welcomed the returning veterans and then transcended 130 years later to here now, where the small towns of Vermillion, Yankton, Salem are sending their sons to go to Iraq and Afghanistan? And I wonder if they themselves won't suffer the same problems that these soldiers faced 20 or 30 years down the line.
You mean in terms of perception?
Programs with the percentage, hooray for service, hooray for this, and then they slowly fade away.
Perhaps, although I think that'd be because there's a larger attack on entitlements than that. The fact this is the first generation getting these things, and I think in the United States, the rise of Medicare and Medicaid and welfare, of even much larger veterans programs than this after World War II, and where any conflict, and it's just sort of an assumption that veterans will be taken care of. There may be quibbles about the size and so forth, but I think that'd be part of a larger debate, I think, about government programs in general, probably. So I would predict not, because I think we're sort of socialized to it, accustomed to it. Now, these guys were the first ones, and I think that was really the problem at a time when no one really deserved that, other than the truly disabled. And again, that was not a controversy. It's the semi-disabled, and the guys that seemed to be a little sickly. That was the problem, and the perception of fraud in that. Yeah.
What factors led to the pensions being given to people in this war, but nothing before then?
Well, they were given in wars before that. There just weren't near as many guys. There's 1.5 million guys, that are eligible for these things. And so Revolutionary War soldiers were given land in payment, and only the truly desperately poor received pensions, and not till like 40, 50 years later. And these pensions are going in immediately, after the war. And it's for people that ultimately aren't all that disabled. I mean, they're certainly disabled, and I don't want to minimize that, but they're not, pulling themselves around on their stumps, so to speak. But we're talking about a few thousand guys that are eligible. Instead of the Mexican War, there were a few tens of thousands, of men in the Army. It's a very short war, and relatively few people are eligible for those. And that becomes an issue actually during the same time, because they're getting into their pensionable age about the same time the Civil War gets over. And quite often the debate, and whenever they expand the Civil War pensions, they expand the Mexican War pensions too. And so the scale had been so small before this. That was the real difference. Just, yeah.
Yeah, you spoke of the animosity that kind of arose between veterans who had served on the front lines and those who had been the coffee coolers and the gophers, basically. On which side of that coin did the soldiers who fought in the Indian Wars fall into? Those who were in the Great Plains during the Civil War?
Well, they weren't really relevant to the question because those are regular soldiers, and so they are volunteers, but they serve in the regular army, and they wouldn't really come in to this question unless they'd also been Civil War soldiers. And so it's not really a question at the time. And there wasn't really animosity between the soldiers. I meant civilians were distinguishing between those soldiers. In fact, the GAR, its official policy becomes there is no such thing as a coffee cooler or mendicant. All soldiers are equal. In fact, that last, tweaking of the pension law, 9 months service is all you had to do. Now, if you're in Sherman's March for 9 months, that's a very different thing, than sitting guard at a prison camp. But that's a very low standard of service when the normal enlistment was 3 years of the war. And so the GAR officially did not distinguish between those things. Anything else? Well, again, thanks for coming.